Well, hi, it is such a pleasure to be able to be part of your worship service today. Thank you for the opportunity to share with you. I've just been so excited to be in a basically empty room with 4 other people because it sure beats my iPhone and I in my lounge room. But can you imagine how great gathering together in the future is going to be? Can we make a pact to remind each other of how much we felt the missing in this season so we never become complacent about the joy it is to freely gather? Is that a deal? Can we shake on it? No, we actually can't shake on it. So when we can shake on it, though, we'll agree about how good it is that we can shake on things as well. Deal? Right, let's look forward to that. I bring greetings from the BUV Support Hub. We've been so encouraged by the activity of churches like Syndal to keep adapting and adjusting and readjusting throughout this season of incredible change and shifting goalposts, to keep focusing on the mission of God and the invitation it is and the opportunity we have to be part of what He's up to in the places He plants us and leads us. The comms team at the BUV have been working to collate and amplify stories of churches who are flourishing in mission, discipleship and serving during this time. They're all on our website for you to check them out, or you can subscribe to receive the Together email, which regularly delivers them straight to your inbox. There is great gospel activity happening across our Baptist churches in Victoria and great cause for encouragement and for hope. Probably one of the highlights of COVID for me, can we even say highlights? Let's say the thing I've loved is watching the creativity and generosity of all kinds of people really come to the fore. In the face of disrupted plans and thwarted celebrations and missing family and friends, people have found ways to break the monotony and bring light and love and colour despite the repetitiveness and the sameness of these days that have rolled into weeks and months and years. It's kind of like that, right? I have a 13-year-old who lives with me, and she's been school attending throughout this time. So the pattern of my day is that I drop her to school, and then I ring my mum on the way home. And mum has adjusted her morning routine to fit around that, so she sits at the table with her porridge while we chat. But we realised we were super groundhogging it. Hello, how are you? Good, thanks, how are you? And so she started to think of creative ways to answer the phone. We tried other languages for a bit and then realised we don't know any other languages. So that was a very short-lived experiment. But she tries and changes her tone or her opening question. You just got to do what you got to do, right? For me, my work previous to this consisted of lots of driving and visiting. Every day was slightly different. Sometimes going into the office, more often meeting with pastors over coffees or meals, ministering in churches on Sundays or team meetings and leadership gatherings. Lots of diversity of people and locations and contexts. And so it all continued, all that work continued, but now it takes place from my computer. I sit in the same chair every day and visit with people all over the state. One week I was in a meeting with my team and I was saying to them how I found it really hard to do everything from the same location. Because normally when I try and remember things, names, details of people's lives, what we've talked about before, etc., I would attach it to a location. And also, in order to try and avoid a temperament pitfall of mine, which is to repeat myself, particularly to repeat stories, I would attach the telling of a story to a location to remember who it is that's heard this story before. I was in a cafe, it was like on a river, there was a school across the road. No, you weren't there. You haven't heard this story. I can tell it again. But now, because virtually everything is happening in the same physical location in my house, the same basic view, the faces on the Zoom screen might change, but everything else is identical. So there's nothing there to prompt me to know if I was repeating myself or not. So I was lamenting about this with my team one day, and when I was just having a little whinge, and when I paused to draw a breath, they said, "Hey Kim, you've told us that story before." I was like, case in point. It's quite paradoxical really that in this current season, we are simultaneously in one of the most world-changing, history-making, record-breaking times of our generation, and also the most potentially boring, mundane and basic version of our lives that we've ever led. And it struck me as I was rereading the narrative of Ruth in preparation for this message today that the same could be said of this story. It's both very, very normal and very amazing all at the same time. It's normal in that the characters in this story are pretty regular people. There are no kings, there's no confrontation from prophets, there are no governments overthrown or epic battles between armies, there's no miraculous feats of nature like floods or digestively obedient oversized fish. It's a pretty simple story with some normal people as the characters. But then it's also quite amazing because as both Mike and Chris already spoiled the surprise ending of the story for you, these somewhat normal people end up in the lineage of Christ. And there's a book in the Bible that's named after the lead character, and you and I are here talking about it and wondering about it and marveling at it thousands of years later. Normal and spectacular. And so I guess we can just bottom line today's message right from the outset by asking this or allowing this story to challenge us with this question. Will you trust God in the ordinary and believe for his extraordinary? Will you trust God in the ordinary, believing for his extraordinary? As we unpack a little bit more from this story of Ruth with a particular focus on Naomi today, and we hold this tension of the ordinary and the extraordinary as we reflect on our own lives and our own circumstances, and we can possibly see a similar paradox at play, let's allow this question to turn over in our hearts and our minds. Can we trust God? Can we trust him in the ordinary while still believing for and looking for and anticipating his extraordinary activity in our lives? As I said, we're focusing in today on the character of Naomi. And the first few verses of Ruth really set the scene for us. And I know we've read parts of them in previous weeks, but they're key to understanding the life and person of Naomi. So let's read that again from Ruth 1, verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab to live there. Now, if you look up Elimelech in the concordances and online, do a search of him, you don't actually find out much more than what we've just read. He was from Bethlehem. The only other thing that we really get to know is that he owned land, because in later verses it forms part of the transaction of Boaz taking Ruth as his wife and purchasing the land, which ensured the continuation of Naomi's family legacy through Ruth. The cultural background at this time is one of a bit of turmoil. It's in the time where judges ruled, where, if we borrow the language of the Book of Judges, there was no king and everyone did as they saw fit, where there was a sense of lawlessness and potentially chaos. The people of Israel were in their familiar cycle of wandering from their covenant commitment to God and finding themselves suffering the consequence, and then a new judge would rise up and bring some sort of order for a season, and then they'd cycle back around again. And so this famine might have been the result of drought or natural conditions that made the land unworkable. Possibly it was due to war or social unrest, or one of the cycles of consequence for Israel. Whatever the reason, Elimelech decides there's no choice but to leave and find food and work elsewhere. And he chooses Moab, which is an opposing nation, so there is this sort of a lot that is left for wondering in that decision, but not the focus of our time together today. So we read on from verse 3, and it says, Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other named Ruth. And after they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Just a little sidebar for a fun fact. Orpah is who Oprah Winfrey was named after. But early in her life, there were so many frequent mispronunciations and misspellings that she just adopted the variation Oprah. You can have that little bit of information for free. You are very welcome. Now back to the actual text. The timeline we have here is a little uncertain, but it's a 10-year period, and in that time, Naomi loses her husband. She has 2 family weddings as her sons find Moabite wives. Then she loses her sons, who we can only assume to be quite young men at the time. Now, there are elements of Naomi's story that many of us, I'm sure, can relate to it at varying levels. There's some who've migrated to unfamiliar countries or places, perhaps because of financial pressures or maybe for the hope of a safer or more opportunity-rich life. There are those who've had to establish a new life in a new place. Poignantly, there'd be many who've experienced the death of a spouse. There'd be some who've experienced the joy and challenge of seeing your adult children find spouses to marry, not to mention those of you who've been trying to navigate that particular dynamic in this COVID season, the intercultural family dynamics, the death of a child. The circumstances of Naomi's death, the son's deaths, are not made clear. But there's no way that takes place that isn't wrought with grief and loss and a sense of confusion to the natural order of things. But here's the reality of the life that we live. We look at this list of griefs and losses and highs and lows and unexpected twists and turns and shared experience and lonely moments and all of the changes. And as abnormal as all of those things are, perhaps to the hope and expectation we might have for our own lives, they are actually the very stuff of normal. Find me an adult person who has not been touched by bereavement, by disappointment, by upheaval of plans, who isn't living some kind of unexpected version of their lives. I remember a friend saying to me once, Kim, my mum and I were talking about you the other day, and we were thinking pretty much everything you wouldn't want to have happen to a person has happened to you. Okay. But then I look up and around to the people who are close to me and the stories of people across the world, and I think my life is so safe and so healthy and so privileged compared to others. Let me say this, you will find what you are looking for if you're looking for comparison. You'll find yourself as blessed as you want to acknowledge or as hard done by as you want to feel. There's literally billions of stories walking around on the earth to pick from, let alone the stories through history and those that are included in the Bible. It feels like the only conclusion we can draw is that normal lives are not perfect, easy, predictable, smooth sailing, set and forget ones. Those are actually quite abnormal. Naomi's story is tragic. In a matter of sentences, she's experienced more than your worst enemy would wish on their worst enemy. But it's not unique in its tragedy. And I don't say any of that to attempt to diminish or minimize her experience. What I am trying to do is close that gap of relatability for us. Sometimes we can look at characters or stories in the Bible and sort of distance ourselves from them on a technicality. Oh yeah, like totally, if a burning bush appeared to me, I'd be obedient. Or if an angel showed up at my work, I'd probably be able to lead a small group of people to defeat a vast army. Or if I was selected to be queen, I might have the boldness to risk my life and stand before a king and speak on behalf of an entire people group. But there are no such opportunities for disclaimers allowed in the entire story of Ruth, and very much so in the character of Naomi. These are normal people. They're dealing with the normalities of life this side of heaven. They're navigating their own humanness in amongst very human experiences. So we can learn from the faithfulness of Ruth. We can learn from the faithfulness of Boaz. And, well, let's see what we can learn from the way Naomi shows up in this story. So Naomi decides to return to Bethlehem. She is now a widow in a foreign country. It's quite a vulnerable position to be in, and there is news that there is some sort of recovery happening back in Bethlehem. The famine is breaking. So her two daughters-in-law decide to come with her. But as they got outside the city, Naomi stops and she says to them, Ruth 1, verse 8, she says, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness," chesed. Mike said I could use that to clear my throat at any time in this sermon. Chesed, "as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye and they wept aloud. They wanted to come with her, but she insisted. From verse 11, it says, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who would become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me. Orpah agrees to return and she says her farewells. But as we saw in week 1 of this series, Ruth commits to Naomi. For Ruth, their fortunes and futures have been intertwined, and she is trusting God to honour the two of them as they look to follow him into whatever the next part of their lives might look like. And then there's this interesting observation in verse 19. It says, so the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" You can imagine it, the chatter and the interest that arose in Bethlehem as Naomi came back to this town she'd left over a decade earlier. And not the same way she left. Now she's an older woman. There are no men with her, just a Moabite woman. And they ask, could this be Naomi? Is it possible? And it's not too much of a reading in to this scripture to imagine Naomi would have looked quite different. She had aged, both in years, but also in spirit. As we read on, we see that the loss and grief has really marked her. Verse 20, she says, "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me. I went away full, but have come back empty. I'm a changed person, so much so I can't even answer to my own name anymore." Naomi actually means sweet or pleasant. Mara, at least in the Hebrew language, means bitterness. This is a massive call from Naomi. Probably the best thing you can say about it is that at least she's being honest. She is not pretending anything. She is unhappy and broken and beaten down. There is nothing sweet or pleasant about her. Mara, call me Mara. That is the name I can answer to. And I think for the most part we get that, don't we? She's experienced so much. She's so disillusioned. She's facing a very uncertain and unprotected future. There's nothing about her life that is what she had dreamed it would be. She's feeling the sting of injustice, and she is pointing her finger directly at God. It's him. It's his fault. He has afflicted me. He has brought this misfortune upon me. Again, maybe some very relatable expressions and perspectives here for some of us as we hear this. But when we consider this story through our lens of the series title, Faithful, if there was a competition between the leading characters, I've got Ruth, she's so faithful, Boaz, he's so faithful, like neck and neck, and then Naomi's kind of coming in a pretty distant third at this point, responding to a similar set of circumstances but in a very different way. And I think the standout difference here is largely a matter of decision. She says, "Call me bitter." It's not just how I feel, it's who I am. I've decided to be bitter by name and by nature. I've decided to take into myself this seed of bitterness and allow it to grow and fester and spread to inhabit every part of my mind and body, to poison my thoughts, my words and my actions with its bitterness, to bear its toxic and destructive fruit in my life. Call me Mara. I am bitter. And so our question, can you trust God in the ordinary? Now, Mike and Chris covered the ensuing story of how Ruth meets Boaz and the way their faithfulness to respond to God's leading and trust in his provision is demonstrated and rewarded. So we jump ahead to chapter 4. Boaz and Ruth have married, and Ruth has given birth to her first child, a son named Obed. And in verse 14, we see the women say to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons has given him birth." There's a redemptive ending to the story of Naomi. Everything is restored to her in terms of security and lineage. She is no longer a familyless widow. And her friends call her Naomi. You don't get to be bitter anymore, Naomi. You can allow some of that pleasantness and that sweetness to come back as the defining aspects of your nature as you care for this child and celebrate all that God will do through him in your family. Will you trust God in the ordinary and believe for his extraordinary? Without being hypercritical of Naomi, because as we've established, she's an accessible character in terms of her relatability, it's evident that in the midst of all the activity of her life, in the mundane day-to-day, as well as the terrible grief and loss she'd experienced, she somewhere lost confidence in God's sovereign love towards her and activity for her. But the echoing question for us is probably exactly how relatable is Naomi to you? As we reflect on the circumstances of our lives, are we trusting him in every moment and for everything, in all aspects, in all ways? For some of you, this idea of the ordinary life resonates because you're feeling a little stuck. You're feeling the full extent of the ordinariness. And that may be because of the current circumstances of lockdown and the way that's kind of shrunk your world or limited the range of your life experience. But it might have been true outside of lockdown too. In early March last year, I flew to Queensland to do a weekend of speaking events, and it was just as the COVID situation was making its grand entrance here in Australia, and it had been a really humid week in Brisbane where my lungs felt heavy because it's one of those things where you feel like you're breathing more water than air into you. And so by the time I'd sat in the airport and watched the news reports and then had a couple of hours to think about it on the flight home, when I got in my car at the airport and I heard the news of some more active COVID cases in Melbourne, I was convinced I was one of them. I was looking up late night chemists and I bought myself a thermometer because I needed to monitor my symptoms. And this was back in the day when they announced individual cases, right? Not clusters and tiers and outbreaks. And on the news, as I was driving home, they said this recent case had visited this restaurant and this grocery store. And I started panicking that I was going to be a case and they were going to have to list where I'd been. Just in those 2 days alone, I'd been in a hotel, multiple Ubers, like a dozen cafes and restaurants. I've been down to the Gold Coast and up to the northern suburbs, a number of different conference and church venues with thousands of people in attendance. I was going to be a super spreader and bring shame and dishonour on my family. That was the only outcome that was possible. And I was telling a friend about this and she said, my greatest fear is that I'll be a known case and they'll say, in the last 2 weeks, she's been to Coles 3 times and stopped at a petrol station. She said, I'd be tempted to make stuff up just so it didn't look like poor boring lady gets COVID. So, relatable? Frustrating? Seemingly endless. Well, whatever it is known. It is known and it is seen by God. We can trust him in the ordinary. For some of you, the rub of trusting God in the ordinary is more about embracing the life you're experiencing as even being normal. I know I fall for this far too often, the idea that someone, somewhere out there, in a different set of circumstances, with a few less things to grieve and a few extra resources and a little bit of extra something going their way, is living a normal life that is simpler or more blessed or more magical than mine. But this is life. All the messiness of the hurts and the hardships mixed in with the joy and the celebrations, the reality of a fallen and broken world acting in fallen and broken ways shapes the lives of us all. And in that light, there's so much more to appreciate when we rise above that brokenness to be truth and hope and life and love to others, to show the face and grace of God, where generosity and favour and encouragement and thoughtfulness and kindness elevates our normal to be a greater reflection of God's created design and desire for us. The encouragement that ministers to my heart frequently is summed up in the words of Joseph when he's talking to his brothers in Genesis. Chapter 50, he says, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives." It's not about what's happening to me or around me. It's about how God is at work to shape it for my good and for his glory. We can make the choice. Do we call ourselves Naomi or Martha? Do we choose bitterness in our response? Naomi's choice for bitterness did nothing to change the circumstances that had happened in her life. It didn't take away the pain. In fact, it only gave it more oxygen. A choice for pleasantness doesn't take away the pain of the experiences either. It doesn't make them disappear. It doesn't make them good. What it does is free us to look for the way God might be bringing his good from that brokenness, redeeming it and bringing a new story of his faithfulness and his goodness to bear in our lives and the lives of those around us. As Mike said in reference to Ruth, and we almost see it in the inverse in Naomi, we have no idea what's at stake for the decisions we are making. Will we show up in the story as a beautiful testimony to faithful obedience and trust in God regardless of circumstances, or as a salient warning of how a wrong decision and an unchecked attitude can turn you into something or someone unrecognisable to others? Will you trust God in the ordinary and believe for his extraordinary? I think the last bit of that question is possibly grammatically incorrect, or at least a little bit clumsy, but it's theologically sound. It's his extraordinary. And his extraordinary may not be what you're thinking. So that list, scratches out, but believe God for a new house, instant six-pack, QR code scanned incorrectly first time. This is maybe not the stuff that's on his list. For better or for worse, I think we're just as likely to underestimate him as we are to get too specific about how we want that extraordinary to show up in our life. Friends, he is a good, kind, just, generous, compassionate, understanding, patient, jealous, pursuing, remembering, creative, powerful, and able God. There is nothing he can't do. And anything he would do is motivated by his passionate love for you. He knows your circumstances. He knows the desires of your heart. He knows your needs. And he knows you more than you know you. And he knows a future that you can't see. Will you trust him in the ordinary and believe for his extraordinary? Let me pray. God, we thank you for this incredible record of a very relatable story of normal people looking to live out life in specific place and context, just as each of us are seeking to do. God, we desire to be written into your story as faithful, to be trusting you in the ordinary of our lives, to be embracing the full expression of how that may play out in each of our individual situations, God, but to trust you, to believe that you are active, that you are for us, you are with us. And God, we want to keep believing for the extraordinary. We know you are a God of the miraculous. We know you can heal hearts and relationships and bodies. And we want to see you do that work in our lives. God, we want to see your kingdom expand on this earth. We want to see hardened hearts soften towards you. We want to see families and children returning to your family. God, we want to see this world reflecting your goodness and your love. And so, God, we keep believing for the extraordinary. We ask that you would keep giving us glimpses of heaven here on earth, that we would be motivated even more to keep expecting that you will show up in miraculous and unexpected ways. God, would you have your way in us and through us, we pray. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen.